Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command. And today I'm going to talk about my dear, dear friend Michael Reaves, who passed away a few weeks ago. And this is very sad for me, but Michael and Elaine are responsible for my career, basically. These two people. You all know Elaine as my wife and writing and directing and producing partner, but Michael was also instrumental in me having a career. He was an amazing guy and had many challenges, but also many, many joys in his life. And I want to just take a few minutes to talk about him. Now, you may never have heard the name Michael Reaves, but you've certainly heard of the things he wrote. He wrote, among many, many other things, he wrote scripts for Space Ghost, for Smurfs, He-Man, Super Friends, Real Ghostbusters, Pole Position, Black Star, Batman the Animated Series, won an Emmy for that, Gargoyles, Invasion America, Sliders, Star Trek The Next Generation, wrote Star Wars novels, wrote original novels, on and on and on. Just a phenomenal guy. And he also writes the Inner World books with Neil Gaiman. So let me take you on the journey, because Harlan Ellison once said that most of the people we think of as friends in our lives are not really friends. They're just acquaintances who will come and go. But there are very few people, if you're lucky, who are real friends. And Michael was that for me. And so let me give you the shape of his life, the journey he and I took together, the highs and the lows, and all of that. Now, first of all, I think I'll show you. This is us sort of at a convention, and you can tell that we're pals. And that's sort of midway through this journey. I first met Michael when I was 20 years old. And I had just come back from Clarion, the Clarion Writers Workshop, where I'd sold my first short story, Leader of the Club, which you can actually hear me read on Mr. Sci-Fi if you just go to the little search box and type in Leader of the Club. And it told me that I could make money as a writer. It was $50. And I had grown up watching Star Trek and Twilight Zone and Outer Limits, and very much wanted to be part of that world, creating shows, writing shows, just being part of TV. TV always seemed magical to me. I loved books, I loved reading books, I loved movies, but TV was the art form that I gravitated toward. But I didn't know how to get into television. I didn't know how to crack it. At various points, I tried writing some spec scripts. Nothing really had come of that. And but I'd come back with this first short story sale. I was an art major at UCLA, painting, sculpture, and graphic arts. In fact, this is a fake cover of the magazine Fantasy and Science Fiction. I painted around them. This was the special Mark Zicree issue, which is limited to a copy of one, but at some point I probably should make that a reality one way or another. But so when you're ambitious, you don't know where to turn. You don't know what's going to happen in your life. And so you hope that your future will be bright. But there's no way of knowing it. I've seen many talented people fall by the wayside. I've seen many really talented people not get their break. I've seen good and bad happen. And yet I wanted to be a writer alongside, my heroes. And, Gene Roddenberry, Rod Serling, Ted Sturgeon, Harlan Ellison, on and on. And didn't know how to get there. So I came back to LA after going to Clarion, and I sold that one short story, but I was midway through my college career as a painting, sculpture, graphic arts major at UCLA. Now, as an undergrad, you're forbidden to take adult extension classes. And yet I saw when I came back that the great Theodore Sturgeon, one of the great writers of science fiction, one of the great writers of Star Trek, was going to be teaching a class in writing. And I thought, well, I'm just going to sign up for it. I'm going to break the rules. I don't care, And so I signed up for this class, kept it a secret from, the undergrad powers that be. And Ted became a friend and a mentor. My photo of him appears on several of his books, interestingly enough, a photo I took when I was 20. But but there were two other people taking that class as well. One was Octavia Butler, who of course went on to a stellar career in books, and we lost her far too soon. The other was a cocky young man who was 5 years older than me. He was 25, I was 20, and he was very sarcastic, very clever, and very ambitious. And he was the teaching assistant of the class because whereas I had gone to the Clarion in 1975, and this of course was all happening in 1975, Michael Reaves had gone in 1972, and some of his teachers had been Harlan Ellison and Theodore Sturgeon. So Ted had said to him, well, first of all, Michael had helped move Ted into the apartment complex in Silver Lake that he lived in. And he said to Michael, well, why don't you be my teaching assistant in this class? So Michael came in, and where we really hit it off was I came one day wearing my Clarion t-shirt, and Michael made some sort of snide remark, and I said, it's laundry day, and I'm that's the only reason I'm wearing this. And and the fact that I could push back, I guess, must have made some kind of impression, because we very quickly became friends. And when you're ambitious, it's very important to be surrounded by people with equal ambitions who are succeeding, because it's like if you're a racehorse and you race with the fastest horses. You need someone to pace you and someone to challenge you. And that was true certainly with Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson and George Clayton Johnson on Twilight Zone. And I soon found myself part of a group of very ambitious young writers, with Michael sort of at the center of it. And Ted became a friend and mentor, but the one who really opened doors for me was Michael. We became very, very good friends. And a month later I met Elaine, and a year later I would marry her. And so all of these wonderful things were happening in my life simultaneously, while I was also painting, sculpting, drawing, doing all that stuff in my classes at UCLA, and taking lots of film classes as well, and other required classes. So Michael was ambitious the way I was ambitious. He wanted to write for television. He wanted to write books. He wanted to write short stories. He was getting some success, and by at that point, he went by the name J. Michael Reaves. His first name was John, but because his father was John, and he was not exactly fond of his father particularly, he didn't want to be known as John, and so he changed it to J. Michael Reaves, and then ultimately Michael Reaves. So dropped the J. But so at that point, Michael was writing for animation, and this is in the 70s, the mid to late 70s. And Michael asked me if I'd like to collaborate with him. He was very fast and getting a lot of assignments, while also having his stories appear in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and getting book deals. So I said, sure. Now, I had never particularly wanted to be in animation, but I saw that as a way into television. And I learned my craft. We wrote an episode of Space Stars together, which featured Space Ghost, and it went well. And then Smurfs was just starting up, so we wrote an episode of Smurfs together. And then it was very clear that I could write them on my own. I learned how to write for characters. I learned how to write stories, how to pitch stories, all the things I would need in live action television. I was learning in animation, how to write to a page count, how to deliver on deadline, never missed a deadline. And I would often turn to Michael for advice, and he was sort of the core of this group of science fiction and animation writers. And in fact, when I started in animation, we didn't have agents. And Michael was the first animation writer to get an animation agent. Her name was Candace Montero, and I was her second client. And soon, very, very soon, she basically represented all the animation writers, and she had like a block of them. And whenever a new series was starting up, we would all go in for a screening of the show or a meeting with the executives. And we would be basically the writers who would write the entire show. And it would be... And so we knew each other. We all knew each other. It was, Mel Gilden and Joe Straczynski, and on and on. Joe Straczynski was also a friend I met around that time, and Michael and I were very helpful, I think, in getting him into various positions of authority and helping his career rise. I talk about that on other Mr. Sci-Fis, and but also Joe was story editing things like The Real Ghostbusters, which we were writing for, or Michael and I wrote all the episodes of Black Star or all the episodes of Pole Position. We were multitasking during that period. And And it's fun when um, you have ambition and it doesn't have a ceiling to it, because anything is possible. And so, for instance, when Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, Michael and I were agreeing that, well, we'd love to write one of those. And now we never got to write for Raiders of the Lost Ark, but Michael did get to write for Spielberg on an animated show called Invasion America. And when Star Trek: The Next Generation debuted, or even before it debuted, he pitched with his friend Diane Duane, another noted science fiction writer, and they sold an episode. And so I was always kind of pacing myself with Michael. If he was writing for a show, I would often be writing for the same show. Or if I wanted to know, how this thing worked or that thing worked in the industry, or, we'd go to conventions together, science fiction conventions, and we'd do things like just regular pal kind of things, going to lunches together, going to movies together. And he ultimately moved in across the street from me in West Hollywood. And he was dating a variety of girls. He usually liked this sort of thin, black-haired, angular type, sort of like Jules Pfeiffer's Dance to Spring character, if you know what I'm talking about. But sort of intellectual, slightly caustic women, and not the best choice, frankly. But Michael was, wound a certain way, and that was, what he was attracted to. Now, he came from San Bernardino, and it was a very smoggy suburb of Los Angeles. He was not eager to go back there. And his family actually came from Monroeville, Alabama, which was the hometown of Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. And that, because I knew that, later when I wrote to Harper Lee, I just addressed it Monroeville, Alabama, and it got to her, and she was very kind. She wrote me a very nice letter and signed my copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. These are, of course, treasures I still have. And so Michael and I were doing very, very well over time. We were earning six figures a year. We were staking out what we wanted the future to be, and we were creating that future. And Michael was very funny. He was more sarcastic than I was, but I could be sarcastic with him. You have certain friends that you can be a certain way with. You can be more blunt. You can be more honest. You can be more forthright. You can share your heart with them in ways you don't share with others. And Michael ultimately met a young woman named Bryn Stevens, or I think she goes by Bryn Chandler now, and she and Michael got married, and she was a very sweet person, and she had ambitions of being a writer as well, and so Michael helped her break into animation and break into books, and they got a very nice house out in the valley, and they would have parties for writers there, and you'd go to these parties, and they were so fun because you would have. You might run into Norman Spinrad there, or Diane Duane was a regular guest, or Linda Wolverton, who ultimately wrote Beauty and the Beast, and you'd find the animated, the Disney Beauty and the Beast, and or Mel Gilden, or Barbara Hambly. Many we were a circle of friends. Marv Wolfman, Len Wein. These people were legends out in the fan community, many of them, but they were all just sort of our pals, our friends, and often, Michael or I might help someone get into animation, or later I'd help people get into live action, or we were friends. We would help each other. Hollywood is often thought of as a dog-eat-dog world, but for the animation writers, that wasn't the case, nor was it the case for the novel writers. We were all supportive of each other. We were all in our 20s and early 30s. We had a bright future ahead of us. There was no bitterness, no cynicism, and Michael and I really were simpatico, and so he had he was much more oriented toward books than I was, and he would write books with his friend Steve Perry, and he'd also write books with on his own. He also wrote a book with Byron Price, that Dragon World, that was a success, a bestseller, and it was just. Everything was possible. And we were working our asses off. I mean, we could turn around a full script in a week or a weekend if you had to, and a rewrite would take a week, and and everything we write was getting made, getting sold. So, which was an experience that many writers in film and TV did not have. But we were the gods of animation, and I was earning six figures in my 20s, and at the same time I was writing The Twilight Zone Companion, and Michael was very supportive of that, by then I was married to Elaine, and Michael was married to Bryn, and they had their first daughter, Mallory, and it was a really lovely time. we'd celebrate each other's work. We'd watch each other's shows when they aired, or VCRs were just coming in at that point, so we might watch them on video. And we would talk about projects for the future and plans for the future, and the idea of writing films and writing all sorts of stuff. And we were writing spec movie scripts at that point, and Michael was just writing at a furious pace and in TV, but never ignoring the books. Always had a book deal. Always was working on a book that would come out like clockwork. And some of these books would come and go, and like Alien was one of them that he wrote for Byron Price. But others would have a little more shelf life, a little more lasting permanence. And then I was after several years in animation, my eye was always on breaking into live action. So I stopped writing animation for 3 months and just wrote a spec script by taking another UCLA writing class. And that script sold, and it got me a pilot deal with NBC that was live action. And then I was hired to develop Captain Power, which I brought Joe Straczynski aboard on and Michael Reaves aboard on. And we... and then I was off and running in live action, story editing Friday the 13th, the series, and producing Sliders and many other shows, as you know, Star Trek The Next Generation, DS9, tons of stuff. And Michael, although he did have one werewolf movie made, I can't remember the title of it, he stayed in animation and books. And he, one of my few regrets in my TV career was when I was I think I was producing Sliders, and Michael called, and he was he was story editing animated Batman the Animated Series, and he wanted me to write one, and I just did not want to write animation anymore. I was done, and so I said no. I wish I had done it, because Batman the Animated Series is one of the great classics of animation. And but there was no hard feelings. I mean, Michael and I could be very direct with each other, and sometimes he'd call me and he'd say, I have to do this script for Dungeons and Dragons, and I don't have an idea. Do you have something in your back pocket? And we'd talk about that. Or for instance, when I was a producer on Sliders, the following season I wasn't on the show, but Michael was going to go into pitch, and I knew the show so well, so I said, okay, how about this? There's a ship that's driven by it's a slide ship. It can go between parallel worlds, but you need a human person to be the drive engine. You need someone, a human, as the motive force, the life energy force. And he went in and he pitched and he sold it, and it got made. So So, we were that kind of, we'd bounce off each other in terms of ideas and in terms of story. And when we started with our careers, we were on typewriter, and then computers came in, so we all had K-Pro 2s, and then it went from there. So I wrote the Twilight Zone companion on Selectric, and then, so when Michael would buy a K-Pro 2, we'd learn these programs working with 5-inch floppies, and then 3.5-inch floppies, and then no floppies, and hard drives, and we had that terrible dot matrix paper that you'd have to tear, for the scripts, and then thank God it became printer paper that you didn't have to tear, and faxes, and then cell phones, and all the technologies. And because we loved science fiction, we looked forward to the technological advances. So cell phones and all of these wonderful things that we live with now were par for the course, and things that we just were so engaged about. And anytime a big science fiction movie came out, we'd go to it, we'd talk about it, we'd think about ways we might riff on it in our own work. So not plagiarize it, but have our version or our say on it. So and meantime we would be creating projects together, and Dante Station, which is this sort of procedural science fiction show set near the core of the galaxy, was something he and I came up with that I still want to make, and so that's something I'll be getting to. But so by then Michael had his son Dashiell, and then he had another son, Alexander, with Bryn. And this is a photo that I have, because this is a photo of Michael being hugged by his 3 children. And for me, this was the most concrete image of love that I've ever seen in anywhere. And so I asked for a copy of that photograph, and he was kind enough to give me one. So but I just find that such a loving and wonderful photo. Of course, his kids are grown now, and Mallory's a writer in her own right. And and Michael went on after the success of Batman the Animated Series. He won an Emmy for it, and although he told me a very funny story, when he got the Emmy, when you win it, it doesn't have your name on the base, and they mail you the little circle with your name on it and what you won for, and then you're supposed to unscrew the bottom, slip that ring over the base, and then screw the base back on. Well, Michael stripped it. He stripped the threads when he did that. And so he had to call them and say, I broke my Emmy. So they said, well, come on in. And he expected them to repair it. But instead they just threw it out and gave him a new one. So the Emmy he won that night was not the one that he actually ended up with. But that was, really fun, really fun and memorable. And so Michael, as his family grew, he bought another house which had been owned by Buster Crabbe, who'd played Flash Gordon and also played Buck Rogers in the serials, and they named that Casa Mongo after the planet in Flash Gordon, and and all seemed to be going well. He went from Batman the Animated Series to producing Gargoyles, which went very well. He did a very good job on that for Disney. Now, also, early on, we were working for all the animation companies. So we were working for Hanna-Barbera and Deke and Filmation and Marvel and just all of them. And then there was a company that was doing animation in Japan, and they wanted into the American market, Tokyo Movie Shinsa, TMS. And Michael was hired to story edit Mighty Orbots, their first venture into the American market. And so he and I wrote a number of those. This is before he was on Batman the Animated Series. And though I do remember Michael was very funny because being a Japanese company, they wanted everyone to live and breathe the company. And so part of Michael's deal with them was, I do not work on the weekends. Weekends are family time. And one of the executives called him on Sunday and said, I'm just calling it's a friendly call. It wasn't really a friendly call. It was a business call. And Michael said, no, it's not a friendly call. This is a business call, and I'm not available today. And he hung up. And he drew the line because family meant that to him. Family, he loved his kids. And so after Gargoyles, Michael did Invasion America with Spielberg, and when I was on Sliders, I brought him in, as I mentioned before. When we both sold to Star Trek: The Next Generation, our careers were often paralleling each other, and I was also writing the Magic Time novels. Sold the trilogy after I wrote the pilot with Elaine. So there was a sense for both of us that we had achieved a lot of our dreams. We hadn't hit the top yet. We both had further worlds we wanted to conquer, but we felt well rewarded by both artistically and financially, because we were both earning six figures a year, and so we weren't the Spielbergs or the George Lucases of the world, and that would have been nice had we been, but in terms of achieving your dream, we had achieved what, 95% of what we'd set out to do. That pretty good percentage. Then when he was in his late 40s, maybe even mid 40s, Michael got a very, very heartbreaking diagnosis. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I remember when he first called me, and he was just totally shaken. And I took him out to dinner, and he was crying because, this is a terrible diagnosis. They still don't have a way of treating it effectively. They have things that can help the symptoms, but nothing that can cure the disease. And he was just feeling very very despairing, and I comforted him. I said, "Look, you're not dead. You have many years ahead of you. I'll be with you every step of the way. I'm going to help you in every way I can." And my goal always was to treat him just the same as I always did, to treat him as Michael and not as the disease. And that became increasingly hard over the years, and I'll get into that. But for many years, he was able to talk, he was able to walk, he was able to keep working. And sadly, his marriage fell apart because of all these tensions, and that was a shame. But Michael kept going, and I was always looking for ways that I could keep him engaged, keep him active, keep him hopeful and positive, and always and allow him his brand of humor and allow him to feel like he was himself, keep his sense of self. So the round table was going by then, my round table. So I invited him, and he became a regular person coming to the table. And even as his ability to speak became much more difficult, he'd bring an iPad and type his comments, and I would read what he typed. And and he was really beloved by the people who attended the table, really just, held in high regard. And because people recognized that although he had an acerbic wit, he had a very warm heart, a very good heart. And just, he was inside, he was mush, and the acerbic comments and quality were just his way of having some protective coloration. And he also enjoyed a good joke, as did I. I remember one time when we were walking in Santa Barbara, he was living there at the time. This is when he had to write notes so you could understand what he was saying. And we walked past a guy who was entertaining children with this white boa constrictor or whatever the hell it was, some big snake. And then as we got further down the way, there was someone walking with a small dog who passed us, heading toward the snake. And Michael made a comment. I said, what did you say? And he wrote it down, and what he said was, "This won't end well." So at the same time, I was looking for things, ways of helping Michael in terms of collaboration, because I realized that it was getting harder and harder for him to type, and harder for him to. He couldn't work at the furious pace he had before. Just physically, it was not possible. And he was so committed to stay functional. He had a brain pacemaker put in one lobe of his brain to stop the trembling and all of those things, and another pacemaker put in the other hemisphere ultimately. And he would have the batteries swapped out as they ran down. And he'd tried to stay extremely functional over these. I mean, he passed away at 72. And he was diagnosed in his mid-40s. So what is that, like almost 30 years with Parkinson's? And so one of the things he did that we worked on that I'm very, very proud of is back in the 70s, they were going to bring back Star Trek, and they did a show called Star Trek Phase 2 that had the entire cast of the original show, with the exception of Leonard Nimoy, who was fighting over merchandising with Roddenberry in the studio at that point. And they were going to do a whole show about it. And Garfield Reaves Stevens and his wife, Judith, they wrote a whole book about this show that never got made, because what happened was, after a year of development, Star Wars came out, and Paramount decided to do the movie instead of the TV series. And it's a fascinating story. They spent a year buying scripts, and Michael went in and pitched 2 great stories, and they would have bought them, except that's when they got the green light to make the movie instead of the show, and they pulled the plug on the show. But I remembered those 2 stories because I really liked them. Michael pitched them around maybe 1976, so that's fairly early in our friendship. No, it would have been later. It must have been, because I'm trying to remember the chronology of this. I guess it was 76, but I remembered it decades later. I remembered it in the early 2000s, and one was a great story about Sulu getting marooned on an alien planet and raising a family, and then being back on the Enterprise in just the blink of an eye. And the other one was a great story about McCoy, where he's a widower, and unbeknownst to him, they cloned his wife, and his wife's clone comes aboard the Enterprise to conduct an experiment, and he has to work with her. And for him, she's his wife returned, but for her, she has no connection to him. And both of these were really good stories. Michael was a very solid craftsman, and he was an idea factory. And so years later, I found out that there were these people making these Star Trek episodes, that they built the Star Trek sets, and they were getting the Star Trek actors, the Star Trek writers to appear in them. It was called Star Trek New Voyages. Later, they called themselves Star Trek Phase 2. It was a fan group, and they were doing this nonprofit. And so I called Michael, and I said, you want to write that Sulu episode with me that you came up with all those years back? And he said, sure. So I contacted the guys at Star Trek New Voyages, and offered myself and Michael as writers, and myself as director and executive producer. And they said, sure. And I got the high-def equipment. I was able to get that together, and I hired an editor for post-production. And Michael and I wrote the script together. And from start to finish, my work on that project, creating that episode, was a year and a half of solid work. And we had George Takei and Majel Barrett, or Majel Roddenberry, and Grace Lee Whitney, plus Christina Moses, who more recently has been the star of A Million Little Things on ABC. But that's where I met her and cast her, and she was spectacular and terrific. And Michael and I had changed Michael's original conception to keep it on the Enterprise, to have the daughter be there, but we just worked out the story together. And then it was very funny, because when we were working out the story at his place, about, I don't know, halfway through or something, we just looked at each other, and it was kind of like, well, we know where this goes from here, and we didn't continue outlining because we knew. And Michael wrote, gosh, I think he wrote Act 1 and Act 4, and I wrote Acts 2 and 3, and then rewrote Michael's first and fourth acts, because I was the director and Michael deferred to me in that way. So if we disagreed on something, he very graciously allowed me to have the final say. And so I put in everything I knew into that episode, and Michael flew to upstate New York when we were shooting it, and he was just thrilled to be on set. He just loved seeing this come to fruition, because he'd grown up on the original Star Trek too. And we were both huge fans of that show and fans of those actors. And so it was a dream come true, because it's one thing to write for Star Trek The Next Generation, which we both did, and that was gratifying, but it wasn't like working with the heroes who had made you who you were. And so it was an amazing time. And by then, Michael's health was worse. He was walking with a cane. It was harder to understand him, but his voice was still, you could still understand him, but you'd have to work at it. And I remember when we did the audio commentary on that episode, World Enough in Time, he called me one day and said, "I've got a cold," and you could understand him more. Somehow that raspiness made his voice better, and so we recorded the commentary on World Enough in Time that day. And also, I told Michael my goal was to get nominated for the Hugo and the Nebula on that episode, and that's what happened. And Michael did up 2 certificates for us to put on the wall, and he was just incredibly happy and proud about that, because he hadn't been nominated for those awards before, even though he'd won an Emmy. And but it was really, really meaningful to him. And so then we were in the 21st century, he and I, and continuing together on this journey. And Michael, when he was coming to the round table, he mentioned that he had an idea, that he had run into Neil Gaiman at a convention, and he had an idea for a book that they could write together, a YA novel. And Neil Gaiman had really loved the idea and wanted to do it. And Michael kept emailing him and writing him, seeing when they would have time to get together. And it never was the right time, because Neil was so very busy. And I said to Michael, go where he is. Go fly to where he lives, rent a hotel room there, and just write the fucking book, like, be there. And he went, and I think in about a week's time they wrote the rough first draft of that novel, and it got a big, 6-figure sale, and now there's, I think, 3 interworld novels. And as the second and third were coming to fruition, Michael's health was getting worse, and so his daughter Mallory stepped in to help co-write it with Neil and with Michael. And that went fine, and now there's talk of a TV series, I believe, and we'll see where that leads. But Michael was just, he always had a knack for the commercial idea, for the thing where you would just say, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's go with that. But he wasn't arrogant. He was never this super egotist where it was like my way or the highway. It was always, he was always just amused and thrilled, just like I am. I'm sort of a softer, sweeter version of Michael, but we both had, shared that same heart. And so as his health was getting worse, and I knew he was having trouble writing, the physical writing, his mind was still sharp. I had written a book, the second Magic Time novel, with Maya Bonhoff, who had been recommended to me. And actually, I think I met her at a convention, and we just hit it off. And she was a wonderful writer to work with, just terrific. And I thought that she and Michael would do very well co-writing books. And so I connected them up at a convention, and they quickly were just, just like that. And so they wrote a number of novels, both originals and assignment novels. So this is The Last Jedi, and this is not a novelization of the movie. This is a novel they wrote before the movie. It's a completely different plot, and but they wrote a number of Star Wars novels and original novels, and they had a very fruitful working relationship. And Maya just loved Michael, as so many people did, and so then, you know, he just he kept going, and ultimately we helped. Rockney O'Bannon and I, Rock created Farscape, and again we all came up at the same time. We all knew each other. Michael wrote for the revived Twilight Zone back in the late '80s, and Rock was a story editor on that show, and also people like Michael Cassett, who wrote for that show, George R. R. Martin, Michael Cassett. I mean all of these people, Alan Brennert. We all, they would show up at Michael's parties, many of them, and we were all again ambitious and young, and with our eye on writing for TV series, movies, books, all of science fiction, fantasy, horror. Those were our wheelhouses. Those were our genres, and we all had the same references. We could reference Frankenstein and Day the Earth Stood Still and Forbidden Planet. We all knew the same books and films. We all knew intimately all of those things, and in many cases, we had known personally many of the writers who had made those books and TV shows and movies. Because back then you could go to convention, you could run into Ray Harryhausen or George Pal or Ted Sturgeon or Ray Bradbury, Harlan, of course. Even Robert Heinlein was speaking at conventions. So, it was. We felt part of a tradition, but we also knew that we were creating a tradition as well. And we were not. And by the way, we were not ever slumming. When we wrote Smurfs or He-Man or Real Ghostbusters, any of those, we were bringing our A game. We were not cynics. We were not looking down on that work. We saw all of it as the same in a way. I mean, we might have more pride of authorship if we had an original novel or an original movie or something, but our idea was, see, in animation, because it was so fast, what you wrote usually was what got made. First of all, everything you wrote in terms of scripts got made, and that's true of my live action career as well. And so it was you had an authorial voice in your work that was reaching millions of people around the world and lasting as long as you lived. I mean, people are still enjoying the movies and TV shows that Michael wrote, and his books are still available. You run into them at used bookstores and new bookstores, and so it's. The great part is that Michael knew that he had accomplished something, and as his health got worse, he ended up at Rockney O'Bannon and I helped get him to the Motion Picture Home, which is a place, a residence for people in the industry who were older and sometimes not well, but it's a good place, and it's endowed by many of the most successful people in Hollywood. And so I would visit Michael there often, and we'd go across the street to a restaurant. But the problem was, by that time, Michael couldn't get volume on his voice, and you couldn't hear him. He could only speak in a whisper, and even then you couldn't understand him really. And it was harder and harder for him to type or handwrite. And so communicating with him became more and more difficult. But I still hung in there. I'd still go and be with him and let him know what I was doing, and let him know what I was working on, and find out what he was working on, and and we would find the way to communicate. And he could still I would still get emails from him. We'd email back and forth, and also when I was successful with crowdfunding, I helped him launch a campaign for a vampire film he wanted to do that Neil Gaiman was going to act in. And sadly, this didn't get made to this point, but they were successful in their Kickstarter campaign, and we utilized a lot of the resources and personnel of the table, who would also work on Space Command, people like David Raiklin and so forth. And so Michael was still engaged. He was still working. He was still writing. He was still active. And then one day, I was going to go visit him, and he emailed me at the Motion Picture Home, and he emailed me, "Oh, good, you'll be able to meet my girlfriend." And I thought, Jesus, is his mind going? Is he got some crush on like a nurse or something? I was worried. I thought, oh, this is going to be embarrassing. But I go there, and he introduces me to his girlfriend. It turned out that there was a young woman who who had her mother was in the motion picture home, and she would go to visit her mother, and she and Michael had hit it off, and she could understand him when he spoke, and they went, and there was a full eclipse of the sun, and they went to where it was visible, and whatever state that was, and they took a road trip, and they had a great time, and ultimately they got married. And she really loved him, Pauline, and she really looked after him, and so she got him out of the motion picture home, and they moved in together in an apartment, and we would visit them, Elaine and I, and keep in touch. And and Michael was hanging in there. He was trying to get physical therapy to get his voice back, to be able to speak again. And my friend. One of my friends made a feature, and Michael actually played someone in it who gets blown up, and they put him in a costume, and he was having a great time. And then with Space Command, when we had the first campaign and it was successful, I said, hey Michael, I have an idea for one of the episodes. You want to write it together? And so we wrote the first couple drafts of Great Solar War, he and I. And ultimately, I wasn't happy with that draft. It didn't go where I wanted it to go. But we're making that available now to people where they can buy it as a perk. I don't know if it's listed yet on the Space Command store, but I'll check that out, because I'm putting some of the PDFs of some of the early drafts of the Space Command scripts there, so that you can buy them and read them, and see what sort of the road not taken was. Arthur C. Clarke did a book called The Lost Worlds of 2001 with the early drafts of 2001. I thought it'd be very fun to share that with you. Meantime, Dante Station, the idea that Michael and I came up with, we were talking about doing that as part of the Showrunners Network, and he was very excited about that. And even when Michael could no longer speak and had great trouble communicating, he came on the set of Space Command when we were shooting early on, and he said to me, "I'm so proud of you," and it meant a lot to me. It meant a lot to me, because we had taken this journey together, and he knew me better than almost anyone except Elaine. I mean, those are the two people who knew me best. I met Michael one month before I met Elaine, and so I in all I knew Michael 46 years, almost 50, and that's a long time. That's a long time, and he studied karate. I once saw him practicing karate, and his physique was just gorgeous. He was just ripped, and it was so sad when Parkinson's took that physical ability away from him, because he had been very proud of being physical and doing those kind of things. And he like so many of us, he made his career from nothing. He didn't come from wealth. He didn't come from a showbiz family. Like so many of us, he came here, and he found what he loved, and he found the way to make it possible to do what he loved. And so many of us are self-made people, and television is such a powerful medium. We are the first generation. He and I were the first generation of television kids who were raised watching television. The previous generation was not. Elaine was 5 years older than Michael, and she grew up with radio, so she knew the Lone Ranger and all those other characters from the radio. I knew them from television. And Michael, because he was 5 years older than me, he watched Space Patrol in the 50s, in the early 50s. I was too young for that show. I never saw it when it was originally aired, but there was a contest where if you named the 10th planet, you would win a full-size spaceship, a full-size copy of their spaceship, Terra 5. And Michael entered that contest, and he didn't win, sadly, but he did get the rocket cockpit that was one of the premiums they had, that was made of cardboard, and he loved that, and he was so sad when he didn't win the contest. But so so I have all of these memories. I have 46 years of memories with Michael, and when he was at the motion picture home, before he got married, before he met Pauline, they had an arts and crafts class to do ceramics, and he had a lot of trouble navigating and making stuff. But this is something he made me, which was the Paladin. He made me a copy of the Paladin, and he lettered it himself. He hand lettered it himself, which must have been very hard and very laborious for him. I ultimately fell off my shelf, and this part cracked. But this is, this is one of my prized possessions. And when I look at this, what it says to me is love, because my friend who had lost the ability to speak, my friend who had lost the ability to move with deliberation, to move quickly, who every motion was faltering, he took the time and trouble to make this for me. And this was his way of saying ongoingly, I'm so proud of you. And, and I'm so proud of him. We both achieved our dreams. And, and I was there every step of the way. And when Pauline called me to say that Michael had died unexpectedly, he'd been in the hospital, and the next day he hadn't been able to aspirate, and he passed away. She didn't expect it. I didn't expect it, but we knew that someday it would happen, and it did. But we're talking now about possibly firing some of Michael's ashes into space, which is what they did with Roddenberry, of course, which is what they're doing with Nichelle Nichols. I hope that happens. I'll have to do a crowdfunding campaign to raise the money for that. But it's 13,000, and I'll put in some of my own money, and you guys can put in some of yours, and I think we can do it. But I'll let you know when that's happening. But we often hope that in life we'll have a pal, someone who's there through thick and thin, someone who really knows us, someone who is, they know our flaws, they know our weaknesses, they know our strengths, they're there in the happy times and the sad. They don't lose patience with us. They're not brittle in their friendship. They're not temporary in their friendship. And that's what Michael and I were for each other. Elaine is there for me in the same way. These are the two great friends I've had in my life, the ones who have been there and who know me and have seen my life grow and change, and who've celebrated and mourned in those times. And, I'm sad that Michael got Parkinson's, but that was the road he walked. But he was always a writer. He was always my friend, and my gosh, he created a body of work that will last far beyond any of us. And I think he did exactly what he wanted to do, and that's a rare thing for anyone to say. So he's survived by his ex-wife Bryn and his 3 children, and by Pauline. And he also has a circle of friends who, when they think of him, they just smile, because he was Michael. And we won't see one like him again. But we're going to have a little get-together soon, just we writers and close friends and family. And we'll just remember Michael and tell stories about him. And I'm sure we'll roll our eyes at some of them. Oh, one other great thing that Michael did that I have to share with you is, we were writing these cartoon shows furiously, at a furious pace. And Michael wrote, there was a show, Space Stars, the one with Space Ghosts, and the villain was named Uglor. And Michael meant to type long shot Uglor, because you have to specify every shot in an animation script. And he'd mistyped it but not caught it. And what he had typed was dong shot Uglor. And and BS&P, which is Broadcast Standards and Practices, the censors, sent him a note on that. And I'm sure they knew that it was a typo, but I'm sure they were as amused as we all were. But it was just, this was a dream come true for all of us. And I just when I close my eyes, I can remember that young, ambitious man that I first met. He always had a beard and mustache. One time he shaved off his beard and he had no chin, and everyone said, put it back on, and he did. And but that was he was a good-looking man and a great friend and a great inspiration for me. So that's about it for now. But I hope that you've enjoyed this remembrance. I'm sure that Michael wrote for one of your favorite shows, if not more. And we'll be back with you again soon. But definitely, we're very close to 100,000 subscribers. And so ding the bell and share Mr. Sci-Fi with people, and we'll hit 100,000 hopefully in the next week or two. So that's it for now, guys. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.